Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, everyone, the alternate history podcast. This is Dylan once again in the host chair, along with three very esteemed gentlemen I have as my panel. Starting in no particular order, I've got Robert Koshu.
Hello, everybody.
I've got Evan Buck, our newest official member of the permanent podcast, joining us.
Hey guys, how's it going? It's your boy Evan.
And Chris has some immortal words I'm sure he wants to share with the group.
Hi, good people.
I was really hoping he was going to do something different just for once. So here we are today, ladies and gentlemen. We are back. We're continuing our series on the American monarchy. Basically, what if a certain, federalist, kind of cadre among the Constitutional Convention of 1787 guys had invited Henry of Prussia to become King of America? What would have happened? And 3 episodes later, here we are. Basically, to refresh you guys from the last episode, we are kind of in the 1820s and 1830s. Basically, after Henry dies in 1802, we decided that the next on the revolving door of European monarchs who never were was going to be Joseph Bonaparte on the American throne. Thomas Jefferson, we said, was going to be his sort of primary chancellor, secretary of state figure, whatever you have, sort of the minister of the interior, whereas the king handles the foreign policy. And that gets us to sort of the late 1820s, early 1830s. And in the last episode, we spent most of the time on foreign policy, territorial expansion, things like that. So we have an America that has taken French Louisiana, some other French Caribbean territories, some other, especially Spanish Caribbean territories as part of the Wars of the Coalition in the 1790s against the Revolutionary French. Now we have a French king who's got to deal with all that and how to figure out all this American expansion. And Thomas Jefferson, especially as a Southerner, you can imagine that after Jefferson is done serving, there's also going to be in the 1820s and early 30s some of the famous American politicians of the day like Calhoun and Clay are going to be sort of his kind of secretaries of state or his chancellors, whatever we want to call it. So there's going to be this very Southern kind of agrarian, small d democratic kind of Jeffersonian, bent to the sort of American political scene. And very, just to go ahead and get it out there, because it's going to be a big part of the discussion of this episode, is the sort of pro-slavery part of, American governance in this time. But you get to the mid 1830s, in our timeline, Joseph Bonaparte was alive until 1844, but we said part of that was probably because he wasn't ruling anything, so he didn't have a lot of stress, and he retired to New Jersey, which is not as known for a place. It's not like Vegas where you can have a heart attack every time you win at the slot machine. It's New Jersey. You're going to go to the turnpike. You're going to try and find Jimmy Hoffa's body. You're going to be back by 5. You're going to watch Jeopardy. You're going to go to sleep. That's all that happens there. So in this timeline, Joseph Bonaparte having a little more stress day to day, not being in New Jersey, he's going to shave some years off of his timeline. So we said he's going to die sometime in, 1834, 35, 36. So that is where we start this episode with this America that has all of French Louisiana, lots of Spanish colonial territories like Cuba and Hispaniola in the Caribbean. It has much more territory than we would expect from our own timeline. And now they're at a crossroads trying to figure out who is their next monarch going to be. And I think, and Chris, I'll let you pop in here because I know you had a really good idea. I think we have an idea of who it might be at this point in time to take over the sort of American throne.
So I'm just, in our timeline, if you really look at U.S. history, especially during the War of 1812, it was not preordained that the pro-slavery Southern side would be the ones to secede from the U.S. There were movements in New England to break away from the U.S. in the War of 1812 because they looked at this and said, well, we kind of don't want to get started with this. We don't necessarily, our interests aren't being served by this war. And I'm thinking about this timeline where you've just had, I guess this would be over 30 years of being run by what they would call the slavocracy, because Bonaparte is very, very friendly to Southern interest. I think off podcast, we postulated that Jefferson would still pass away when he would he have passed away when he did, or would that have been a little bit sooner because he was still involved as a statesman?
I don't know that we decided. I don't know that it really makes a huge difference, because I don't think he would have been the Chancellor or the Secretary of State all the way till his death.
Mm-hmm.
I do think he's not going to die with the sort of romantic him and John
It's
Adams
not
writing
him
letters
and
to each
Adams
other
on
on
the
July
same
4th,
day.
but
him and
it's
John
not
Adams
that,
and the
but
bromance. Exactly.
yeah. The bromance is not, Sly and Arnold levels of sort of fist bumping, but he basically, for all intents and purposes, I think he's died because he's been retired for at least a few years.
But we also thought about maybe like a John C. Calhoun coming in, because Bonaparte is tied to the Southern interest. And I think if you are sitting in Boston or New York or Philadelphia in the 1830s, you're looking at this saying, wait a minute, we fought the revolution. We put up the Continental Army to break away from the English monarchy, and now we've been ruled by a Southern monarchy for 30 years. We aren't getting our own out of this. And I think one of the things we had thought about off podcast is, we've if we're doing a tour of European royal families, I guess, I'm going to still call them the Saxe-Coburgs, because the British monarchy is still kind of toxic to us. We still don't want to go there. France might be a monarchy at this point again, but we've had a French monarch. We've had a German monarch, even though Germany isn't a thing yet. But the royal family we haven't had is the Romanovs, especially with their role in winning it might have been the War of the Eighth Coalition or something like, in deposing Bonaparte, in deposing Joseph's brother, actually. They are a major European player, and they haven't had any American. They haven't been discussed yet. And I think I have a really good option for the American monarch, being Constantine, the brother of the actual Tsar. He was basically viewed as somewhat of a liberal. There was a bit of a revolt when Nicholas came in. Nicholas I, not the famous, not the Nicholas most of us are thinking of. Nicholas I, when he came in, trying to put Constantine on the throne, because he was surrounded by a group of officers who had served in France, had served in Western Europe, and in the Russian mindset had gotten infected. They had picked up European habits. They had seen the French Revolution, the effects of the French Revolution. They picked up kind of more Enlightenment ideas and thought they wanted to put Constantine on the throne as a constitutional monarch. And fun fact, I will not make fun of Dylan for this. There is a band called the Decemberists. These officers are who that is named after. In December of 1824, during Nicholas's coronation, these officers tried to put Constantine on the throne. They failed, and I guess 100 years later, some emo punks were taking a survey course in Russian history, found this name and thought it would be cool. That's the only thing I can think of for them. That being said, I think you've got the Romanovs as a major European royal family. They've got a troublesome offspring, kind of like Henry, in the way that we want, we want him to do something, but we don't really want him hanging around court that much anymore. And I the other thing is, I think we've got an American chancellor lined up for him. The other side of the Thomas Jefferson bromance, John Adams, his son is, in our timeline, I guess he's already been president, but he was coming of statesman age, is John Quincy Adams. Before he was, he might have been directly ambassador right before he became president. I don't know what other offices he held, but basically
he was Secretary of State.
He was Secretary of State.
He followed his dad to the court of St. John. He was with his dad when he was negotiating the Dutch, financial stuff in the early days of the Republic. So he's basically probably at this timeline the most European knowledgeable person since Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson are dead.
And he served as U.S. ambassador to
Russia,
St. Petersburg. And I think he is he brings balance back to the United States, brings regional balance back, brings, some skin in the game back to New England. And he also, everybody benefits from this. The Russian monarchy gets rid of a troublesome duke brother, and the United States gets its next king from a powerful friend.
Well, and one that's on the outside looking into the sort of European political sphere. Because at this point, this is still Russia. Russia has always had this complex about wanting to be seen as European versus wanting to be seen as sort of Asian or backward or what have you. So I think there's going to be a natural kind of affinity between the Russians who they don't like the Enlightenment ideas, but they want to be seen as one of these European, community members. But they're kind of upstarts. They're kind of outside. And the Americans who are going to basically be the same thing on the other side of the Atlantic. So I think there's a natural partnership there.
Yeah, I'm kind of liking how America in this timeline that we've created has basically just become the place where cast off younger brothers are being shipped off to. I do have a question though, in terms of the timing. Sorry,
I'm going to jump in and say, it's interesting you say it that way, because in actual American history, not of crown heads, but of important noble families in Britain, that is kind of what they did with the Americans in colonial times.
The British have creative ways of getting rid of people that they don't want either to America or to a whole different continent in Australia.
We just got done talking about New Jersey. All right.
100%. But my question is in terms of the timing of this, Constantine in our timeline, so the whole Decemberist thing happens in 1825. In our timeline, Constantine actually dies relatively young in 1831. Okay. So are we saying that this would happen because, Bonaparte in our timeline is dying, 1834 to 36? So are we saying that Constantine would come over and become the chancellor first? Or are we saying he would become the king and he somehow lives longer than he does in our timeline?
I think he lives longer.
Yeah, I
in
mean
ours.
he dies
Okay.
of cholera, so I think there's enough of a random chance coin flip that you can say he just either recovers from the cholera or doesn't die of it, and then maybe is one of the things that the Russian court does after the Decembrist revolt is they ship him off to be ambassador over here as an attempt to get him out of the way, and that's what exposes him to the sort of American political sort of machine.
Okay. I like that. I was just wondering because I was trying to put
Yeah, because I was thinking on the same thing. So I was like, cholera might be a problem here.
Yeah, I was trying to add things up together in my head, and I'm like, the math ain't mathing. So I like that. That makes sense.
Yeah, so we'll say that's what at least gets him over here, and I think that makes him a natural sort of monarch. So basically, to set the stage, kind of in 1836, we've got a sort of a new Romanov American monarch here. We've got John Quincy Adams, probably like we talked about, the most European culture wise, the most educated American probably alive. Now setting the stage, ironically enough, as a sort of home interior focused position as sort of chancellor or secretary of state, but importantly, very anti-slavery, being from New England, being raised by his father, notoriously also anti-slavery, also Protestant, which I think is going to also be something worth at least kind of tangentially talking about in our discussion, because a lot of these territories that America would have acquired from France, Catholic country, and Spain, a Catholic country, are going to be, as one probably might imagine, fairly Catholic, at least in the Caribbean and sort of the near Mississippi. Further out west, obviously, there's less settlement, but that's certainly at least going to be a friction point. So now, after a couple decades of sort of pro-Southern, slavocracy sort of sentiments in the sort of governing machine, you're now seeing the pendulum swing the other direction. So late 1830s, you imagine you've got kind of a less, Russians have serfs, which are very much a problematic thing, but this is not the sort of American chattel slavery that we sort of commonly think of. And so it's at least a different system that's going to come up and be kind of a problem.
At this point, also keep in mind, there's a large movement in Russia realizing, hey, we need to get rid of these serfs. And that was one of the things that a lot of people pinned on Constantine, is doing some of those reforms to modernize Russian society.
And here's the thing, in Prussia as well, like Prussia was kind of, with the results of like the European wars and everything, they were also trying to become, more enlightened, more updated in their governance and in their outlook. So in 1807, the Prussians actually had abolished serfdom with the Stein-Hardenberg reforms. So I think if we have an America that's much more closely tied to Prussia and kind of in lockstep, we're probably going to have something around that same time frame. So we can have this Russian king coming in that's very used to, serfdom and that system, but he's already very reform-minded, coming into a culture that has probably by this point already abolished serfdom. And then that leads us into what I think is going to be the big thrust of this episode, which is, how do we deal with America's original sin of slavery, chattel-based slavery, and what is the push or the impetus away from that, or how does that play out?
If we're dealing with a reform-minded Russian king and an abolitionist, knowing that John Adams' dad was willing to negotiate the compromise that led to 3/5 to get the Constitution and put it together, is the compromise at this point a let's move chattel slavery to a serfdom model, which is slightly different, but a little better, has kind of a gradual shift over? And is that acceptable to the Southerners? I'm just going to throw that out as possibly the first move.
I'm not sure, because what I think the debates are not necessarily anything to do with the status of people in South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi. I think the debates are the status of the unorganized territories.
Hispaniola,
Cuba.
Cuba, because we've taken those in this timeline.
Mhm.
They're ours.
Mhm.
And I think the advantage is that we have a lot bigger pie. I think the dividing lines line up similar to the way they did in our timeline of, we're not talking about reforming the institution where it is. We're talking about how to admit and how to cut up new territories and admit those, whether they be slave and free. And the fact is, in this scenario, we have more states to cut up. Please understand, Robert, my apologies. I don't think Texas is surviving this as a single unit.
Probably not, but that's okay. We can become 5 in any given moment. That's our right. So that's the best part about being part of Texas is we
God
can be
bless
5 in
Texas
any
and
given
their
moment.
rights.
But yeah, and that's because the reality of it is, in Texas, chattel slavery only really worked well in the southeast corner of Texas. It does not work in the west. It does not work. It works partially in the north. Hill country, it does not work at all. Hence why the Germans ended up there and ended up having major issues during the Civil War. But chattel slavery does not work anywhere except one small corner of Texas. It's not like it's not built right for slavery to exist with the plantations. Matter of fact, one of the second most known plantations, China Grove, is actually about 15 minutes from my house, and that is Albert Sidney Johnson's plantation. And he actually commented that it was really more of a ranch than a plantation at the time. So even in the area where we were, where I live, down south of Houston, it is not the most ideal for growing cotton and that the labor intensive farming that you needed slavery for. Cuba, however, with sugarcane fat fields, is all about plantation slavery, or can be all about plantation slavery. And this, so I 100%, if we don't do a compromise to go to serfs immediately, then okay, you guys get Cuba. That's a pretty big chunk. Look at all the sugar plantation you get there.
Well,
they get Cuba, they get Hispaniola.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is something we talked about, and this is a really interesting point. Do they get Cuba?
Yes.
We talked about this off podcast in a previous episode in some other alternate history we created. We spent a lot of time talking about an expanded Texas, where the Republic of the Rio Grande, I think, came into the United States, and the United States took a lot of northern Mexico.
We got northern Mexico and the Yucatan.
And the Protestant, really still kind of Puritan, John Quincy Adams might have something to say even about abolitionist Mexicans. And I think this is something worth thinking about, is like, I mentioned previously, like, would the United States Senate seat Santa Anna? Would we allow in the kind of senators that are going to be elected if we admit Cuba as a state? Or do we admit Cuba as a territory? And I think the other interesting thing that Evan was talking about, it was Dylan was talking about, is right now we are dealing with in our United States in this time, property requirements to vote have basically gone away. But do we admit Cuba or Hispaniola? Because I'll tell you right now, that brings a lot of other things into this if we actually admit them. do we admit them as full states? Because you have very culturally different areas, culturally different from the American South. Is the American South willing to make a common cause with these groups in these areas, or does it create a problem for them? Go.
Well, I think so. I think that becomes the crux of the question of, okay, the slavery versus serfdom versus you know free individuals kind of question. Because we talk about the reform from slavery to serfdom, but what I'm about to talk about, I'm speaking purely on economic grounds. Like obviously, if you look at the practical impact, they are very similar in terms of what they do, but structurally, economically, they're really not related systems. Slavery is obviously the acquisition of people as property, as essentially,
Mm-hmm.
and again, I'm using the parlance of the times for anybody in this podcast, comparisons that for us to sort of think about how these people would have thought. It's like buying a horse, whereas a serf, strictly speaking, it's a free person in the medieval sense of a free person, because obviously your freedoms were way different, who is just restricted in terms of where they can live. It's a property restriction in terms of where you can go, not that it is a property restriction in terms of
You yourself are
you
not
property.
property. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
not property. You are
You're
simply
just chained to the
you are
property you work
under
on.
the
your kids are going to do
lordship
the
of an
same thing
area.
as you. So I think that may be where the question comes in terms of what happens with Cuba and Hispaniola, and what happens with some of the Western territories in terms of the Louisiana Purchase, especially I'm thinking in the sort of near Trans-Mississippi, where they're already going to know primary areas of resource extraction.
Yeah.
So
I
a
kind
lot
of
of your
personally
timber, a lot of
feel-
your mines, that's where serfdom's going to be, because this is where you need a fixed, trapped population for resource extraction.
Yeah, I actually really like that. I agree with that, because I think with a reform-minded Russian and John Quincy Adams kind of being the duo, I think even though they are reform-minded, they would also be very, pragmatic. Practically, they know that, freeing the slaves overnight would probably lead to, civil war or some kind of just very deep sense of discontent. Like, it doesn't really matter if Cuba and Hispaniola are these massive territories that, can have this sort of chattel slavery, if the national government is just all of a sudden saying, okay, yeah, we're just going to do away with slavery. That's why we had to have this in our timeline, very delicate balance of, the compromises, the various, and even then we had a lot of events like Bleeding Kansas that happened due to some, gray areas or unclear, parts of the law. So I think that having this sort of transition to serfdom for certain, areas, certain races, certain people would have been an appealing halfway compromise that would have kept the economic realities, functioning well enough. And, yeah, maybe the more, the genteel, antebellum South might not have been as pleased with it, just based on like their cultural understanding, what they were used to. But it would certainly, I think, in a sense, they would have realized, hey, it's better than having us losing, quote unquote, all of our property, end quote. Like, I think they would have realized, you know what, we're still going to be able to have these people work for us. We just don't have exclusive, control over them, I guess, is a good way of putting it.
I don't necessarily agree with that. And the reason's this. Agriculturally, I think Virginia, South Carolina, the coastal South quickly depleted their land. Like the nutrients in the soil got depleted. And one of the things that was important for them was the ability to take up their population and move it to new fertile land. to
Well,
deplete
they
those
had to
lands.
because they killed the crops. The way the chattel slavery worked and cotton worked, as they would plant, they would literally kill the land. They didn't understand the agriculturalness of a fallow land for a period.
They didn't get crop rotation, nitrogen seeding, and all
so
that.
The land's dead, so they would pick up and migrate. And matter of fact, where most of the East Texas people ended up here from South Carolina and Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. That's who settled there. The Tennessee people went more hill country up north. Kentucky came in that same area, but they came here because they moved in lock, stock, barrel, brought the wife, the kids, and all the slaves who built a new plantation house.
And so in these new lands, you need to be able to have your workforce be mobile. You cannot use them as serfs, because you look at this and say, oh, I'm bringing in all of my workforce. I'm going to deplete this land in 30, 40, 50 years. If the workforce is tied to the land, if they're serfs like we talked about, they look at this and say, wait a minute. I'm going to put all of the capital into this. I'm going to get 20 years of crops out of it, but then it's going to die on me. I can't have a serf workforce because I need that labor population to be mobile.
So would this have actually, in the end, either led to this policy not being implemented, or would it have led to conflict because we have the national government trying to promote this serfdom idea and all the southern plantation owners saying, hey, we can't go for this?
I don't think serfdom's even a starter. I don't think serfdom even becomes a thing.
And I threw it out as an option.
Yeah.
Now, the other thought I have is, Chris, for Cuba and Hispaniola, did we basically do what Texas did in Texas? So what Texas did in Texas is the American came in, looked at all the land, and the Mexican person said, here's my deed to the land. I own this 5,000 acres. And the American judge looked at it, ripped it up, threw it away, and said, John, that land is yours now. And I wonder if we do that in Cuba, that we, in essence, immigrate Americans in, take land away from the landed gentry in Cuba, and give it to the American plantation owner that decided to, Joe Bob and John Bubba decided to split the plantation. So Joe Bob took off to Cuba with half the slaves, and this was Senor Castillo's plantation. Oh, Senor Castillo, I'm so sorry. Now it's Joe Bob's.
So I think the first thing
that is literally what we did in Texas.
I think that is what happens in Hispaniola. I think you do have you America is not going to admit Toussaint Louverture to the Senate. We are not going to allow them. That's just not going to happen. They will send American settlers in to create the upper crust of Hispaniola, to basically replace the French upper crust of Hispaniola.
Yeah.
I am not sure if they do that in Cuba, only because of the Peninsulares. There's an amount of Cubans that basically under the, I wish I would have looked up what episode it was that we talked about this, because, we're referencing it a lot here, but you have a lot of Cubans who trace their lineage 100% back to Spain. That's, Peninsulares. I think we may be okay with them. Maybe a reverse of Texas, because Texas allowed in American land prospectors, farmers, etc., as long as they nominally converted to Catholicism. And later on said, after that, then Mexico started discussing slavery. I think maybe the United States is okay with Spanish Cubans and admits Cuba as a territory with a completely new racial system as a requirement for suffrage / representation. That's what just because it's always easier to co-opt the local elite, especially when you've already got a territory where you're trying to settle in. We are wholly exporting an American elite, a ruling class, to Hispaniola. We've got people in Cuba that might be acceptable to enough people as long as they nominally convert to, and maybe even we don't even require them to convert. But I just think we've got enough people there that would be acceptable to American Southerners.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the real question then comes to what happens with all this territory we got from French Louisiana. Does that become sort of, okay, is it a slavery or not slavery question? Is it some sort of tripartite thing? Is that where serfdom in some of those states becomes more of an argument? Or what are we looking at in westward expansion here?
I think you have something similar to the Missouri Compromise. I know that's a little bit earlier, but but
it gives the gist of the idea. Yeah,
but you actually have it respected.
Yeah. Well, and because there's more territory, to throw up, and I guess that leads us to another thing that's happening around this time that we haven't really talked about yet is the Pacific Northwest, because we have with the Russians now being on the throne, this is sort of the last gasp of what is going to end up being Seward's Folly when we buy it in 1868.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Russian Alaska. So the 1830s is really kind of the last time it's kind of potentially viable when the Russians can really get anything out of it. Especially in the late 1820s is when you see them sign the treaties that sort of establish the boundaries between sort of British North America and American North America vis-a-vis Russia. So this is kind of a fertile time for Russo-American relations in terms of westward expansion, because you can very easily see possibly, the Russians essentially doing what they did 40 years down the line, just a little bit earlier, essentially selling it or trading it or some part of some treaty. Maybe they just cut bait and run, do some sort of resource trade rights with an American Romanov to spite the British or what have you. So, Alaska is very much on the table.
Which I think is very viable because, the Russians were looking... Yeah, Russians were looking for a way to get rid of Alaska for a while. Mm-hmm. And I talked about this on the Discord recently, how I had just found out like a week or so ago that the Russians actually tried to sell Alaska to Liechtenstein in the 1850s. And so I think this is actually, we have precedent in our timeline to basically say that they have been trying to get rid of this territory for a while to any open buyer. So if we have a Romanov on the American throne, we have, the Louisiana territory. It just kind of paves the way to make a earlier acquisition of Alaska much more plausible.
I think we do. I'm a little unsure. I think we might put off a little bit connecting it. In other words, we bought the French and Spanish claims to Oregon and what is today Washington. I feel like Vancouver what is today British Columbia, may be similar to what happens in our timeline, where it's disputed. The thing is, and I'm working towards something. I have something in the future.
You're cooking.
I feel like right now it'll be the status of the connector strip, I guess, is the best way to think about it. Might be left ambiguous. I feel like eventually, though, if it's not the United States advancing into Canada, if it's the United States connecting to existing American territories, I think that fundamentally changes what happens when we do get to the U.S.-British negotiations in Columbia, British Columbia, Vancouver area. And I think the U.S. does. Okay, it's not going to be 48. It's no longer the lower 48 because the 49th connects directly to it. I know that Cuba and Hispaniola and everything else is in. We split up Texas. I can't do the math. But
well, because the other thing is, remember, we tried to take a lot of that territory, and it's because of Winfield Scott showed up, did a major negotiation, and got it all calmed down. So there is no Winfield Scott. We may have a Winfield Scott, but he's not Winfield Scott like we know he's Winfield Scott in this timeline, because he only exists because of the War of 1812. And has the grand man of the army. And we don't have a Mexican war where we get to kill him and all his lieutenants on a boat either at the same time, where we got to kill the entire staff off. But if he's not around, plus we've got Russian territory that we're taking over, do we go ahead? And I agree, Chris, we're going to go ahead and grab that British Columbia, and that's 49, and then Alaska's 50, and whatever numbers they all end up being in the real world, in our timeline world. But that, in other words, basically that section of Canada is America at this point, connected to the next state up. And then Yukon we can debate over, but we may not have wanted Yukon because there's not much there in the Northwest Territories except snow and ice.
Yeah, and I think sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, but I think what we're looking at, we would see an American Alaska, but getting back to the Missouri Compromise thing, what we probably are going to see is Wisconsin, Nebraska, probably Kansas, Iowa, all admitted to the U.S. much quicker because we're not going to be debating what does the slavery side get for this, because we've got stuff to give them.
We have a lot of territory to give them.
And territory where it fundamentally makes sense to use that economic system. I think we might even split up Texas.
Yeah, I can see that.
Oh no, we split Texas because the South, like I said, the southeast corner of Texas is very acclimated for plantation slavery, or chattel slavery in plantations. Hill country is not. So, hey, the Austin West area, that's a separate state, no matter what we do with the panhandle and everything else. But there is a line, I'm going to say somewhere probably along where the Colorado River runs in Texas, maybe the Brazos, Colorado kind of intersection there, that somewhere, probably the Brazos River, that somewhere along the Brazos River, everything east of the Brazos is slavery. Everything on the other side of the Brazos is not slave.
I also think, I don't want to revisit stuff we already settled, but I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. I think in our initial westward expansion, maybe it is just our modern Louisiana purchase, because we didn't really address what any of this does. We didn't address the Spanish ulcer. We didn't address what any of this does to Mexico. So I think
Oh,
we might.
I was thinking about
I'm
that.
cooking on something. I'm
Okay,
just waiting
yeah.
until the time
Yeah,
is
I
right.
was thinking about
Yeah.
that in the back of my head.
Yeah, I have
What
an
happens
idea of
with-
how we get there. Don't worry.
Yeah, well,
Good. I want to hear
good.
it.
So
Because I'm
Yeah.
thinking
Yeah,
about
so-
where
so-
Manifest Destiny, James K.
Yeah,
Polk,
so-
all of this stuff happens.
yeah, so
if
I
it
think
happens.
yeah, so I think that's kind of the next natural progression is you have sort of the Louisiana Territory, and what really gets us back to a version of Manifest Destiny in this timeline is Russian Alaska.
Yep.
And here's why.
Mhm.
So Russian Alaska connects us to the Pacific. The Russians actually had forts all the way down as far south
I think
as
it was far
Northern
south as
California.
Northern California, San Francisco,
Yeah.
I think.
Yep.
There was a presence there.
Mhm.
So in the mid 1840s, what you're looking at is a U.S. that is essentially, imagine a diagonal from Florida up to Alaska. That's
Mhm.
kind of the United States axis that we're at right now. But because you've got Mexico now free from the Spanish, but we have all these former Texas, states that we've now cobbled together into some Frankenstein Rubik's cube of what once was Texas.
No, we haven't. We haven't because it's all Coahuila.
It's still Tejas and
Mexico.
Coahuila.
Yeah,
It's still
but
Mexico.
from our perspective, in terms of like the states, it doesn't matter. It's still Mexican Texas,
It's
Yes.
Mexican Texas. We don't have it yet.
which is where I'm going.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, we got to talk about getting.
there's that issue in terms of there's going to be Americans coming over like historically they did in our timeline. But to add to that fire, which historically was basically enough to set the whole thing off in and of itself, you also have disputes with, Mexican California over what's the extent of this treaty. It's going to be less of we're worried about the northern end with sort of Oregon and Washington vis-a-vis the British, and more on the south end vis-a-vis the Spanish and Mexicans. And Mexican, California, Arizona, Nevada, they already know there's a bunch of metal out there. The Spanish have been mining silver in Nevada and Arizona for 100, 150 years at this point. So that James K. Polk-esque cohort is going to be eyeing, there's going to be a whole class of people that have come up in this sort of rapid rash of expansion, especially in a monarchic America where you can kind of imagine there's going to be almost, royal charter-esque monopolies, not necessarily on a grand scale, but there are going to be some of them in some small areas or in some medium-sized areas. These are the people that are going to be pushing at Mexico. And what's, I think, say it's hard to get specifics because we're in hypothetical land, but say some territorial dispute involving the discovery of gold in a area of California that can reasonably be argued to be covered under the Russian treaty that acquires Alaska is what sets it off. And Texas, obviously, that's its own thing.
No,
I think that's what gets us there.
I
I see that.
And the other part of it is this. I think, no offense, Evan, in our timeline, we kind of
He's going
got
to insult Northern California, just a heads up.
no. I am not going after.
Hey, you can insult Northern California all you want. I live in Southern California.
Yeah, he
Okay,
does, he
so
does.
we're good.
First and foremost, I don't think you live in the same state as them after
Yeah,
this scenario.
I agree. I don't think I
But the other part of it is this. I think with the valve release of the Caribbean Empire, we don't have American settlers looking to go into Texas. So in our time, in our telling of the Mexican American War, we take over California as an afterthought. I mean, there's like
Is that really
honestly,
the case though? Like let me throw this out there. In our timeline with, the
Mhm.
British and the 54-40-year fight sort
Mhm.
of thing, we didn't really have any reason to try and do what we call, as Dylan called, the diagonal Manifest Destiny Empire, right? We basically kept Russian Alaska that we just purchased separate from the lower 48. Here, I think we have significant incentive to. We were talking about we might not acquire the Yukon. in this timeline. The Yukon is just a bunch of ice until in the 1890s we have the Yukon Gold Rush. So there is a possibility for us wanting to fight over that at some time or other. So we have the escape valve of the Caribbean. We have, this just natural progression to the northwest. So what if in this timeline the Spanish kind of function as the British did in our timeline, where we negotiated the 54-40 fight issue. We decided they can have British Columbia. We take Oregon and Washington, that whole area. But instead, it's flipped southward. So we go all the way down to Northern California, maybe leave, Arizona,
Nevada, or something. Yeah.
What we would today call Southern California. We just leave that to Mexico because we don't really have any interest there.
Yeah, we do. We do very quickly.
I think we do quickly, but at the time of negotiation, I don't know.
I think what happens is the discovery at Sutter's Mill sends Americans into Northern California, and Northern California becomes, like Robert was setting up, like maybe with the dispute is whether it's the American River or somewhere else.
I think Northern California for sure. I'm not sure if southern part.
I kind of see where Evan's going.
Okay.
I don't. So part of the other thing we have to imagine this timeline is America is much more relatively sandwiched negatively than in our timeline.
Okay.
Because in this timeline, we have stolen shit off. We have stolen stuff off of all of our neighbors. They don't like us. We have to tread.
Hold on a second. I'm saying
we stole independence from the British. Yeah. We stole Louisiana from the French,
who are no longer our neighbors.
But we stole Cuba and Hispaniola from the Spanish, who are not involved. But the Mexicans are not going to have warm fuzzies about that either. Because
the Mexicans don't have part of the reason the Mexican War succeeded so well is you have to remember all of this vast territory. Yeah, they were mining it and they were doing other things in that, but the vast majority of northern Mexico through that Arizona, Nevada, all of that was relatively unpopulated.
There was nobody there.
Yeah, and so part of the whole problem Mexico had is we're giving it to them, but there's nobody there and we're not doing it. And we just basically, we could stick a flag in it and say it's ours, but in reality, there's no one there to resist us moving in.
I think what happens is a Mexican-American war around 1846, 1847.
But it's over California, not the Texas border.
Triggered by California.
Yep.
I can see that.
But that leads to a similar territorial acquisition.
Yep.
Yeah. Maybe without the Texas purchase.
Yep.
Part of it.
We end up with Texas. We end up
with
through
the Colorado,
Southern California,
and the Colorado, and then Middle California.
And that's what makes Southern California be a distinct state because we'd already established North Carolina. Now, North California has a territory at a minimum. So the southern part of California, maybe we have a northern and southern California.
Well, because the other part of it is this. I think the Central Valley and the Imperial Valley of California, as agricultural as they are, might actually be candidates for. I think the split in California is the southern border,
free slave state,
the demarcation state.
Okay. That's an interesting way.
That's a fascinating way of thinking about it.
And that then presents the problem of you now have slavery on the West Coast, which is one of the things that in our timeline, the Free Staters were so adamant about dealing with. California is really arguably the capstone of the whole, row of dominoes that eventually led up into the Civil War. So that's really an interesting position that puts us in if you now have a slave holding presence on the Southern Pacific.
It's just so alien compared to our timeline because literally the first Republican candidate for president, John C. Fremont, where's he from? California, right? So this to me, I'm just kind of wrapping my mind around it we have a slave presence in Southern California and free in Northern California, because in our timeline, we basically have a California that's like one of basically the Western headquarters of anti-slavery.
Well, and this is now going to put, because we've talked a lot about sort of the economic forces, a lot of the Southern agricultural product movers and shakers. They're the ones now, because of the material that the sort of political situation, to put a polite name on it, in our new Southern California. This is now going to throw back to another previous episode we did where we talked about a Southern Transcontinental Railroad. Those conversations are going to be much more prevalent as we go from the 1840s into the 1850s in terms of, okay, now that we have all this new territory,
you need
where is all these?
You gotta have a way. You gotta have a way
need
to
the railroad.
take all of
this stuff,
all of
and
these slaves over to the West,
or we go get we go to the Isthmus much quicker.
Yeah. Yes.
Ooh.
But I think those. Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I think we need to take some blood pressure medication because we're getting very excited about a lot of things going on here. But I think what we need to do is this. We need to kill Constantine.
That's exactly where I was going, because he's going to be, if we get him till the late 1840s, he's going to be close to 70.
Yes.
Yeah. He's
He
not
was
going to live
52
much
when he
longer.
dies in 1831. So like he can't go retire to New Jersey, to keep our metaphor going.
And well, hey, we just got Vegas, and there's a lot of holes in that desert, and a lot of problems are buried in them holes. All right. So here's the thing. Also, John Quincy Adams dies in 1848, and hey, some of you probably took some European history classes and realized there's a lot of other stuff happening in 1848. So I think 1848 is the time to kill him all.
I agree.
Yep.
The United States has won the Mexican-American War. The map looks basically like ours. Like the southern border looks like ours does. California hasn't been admitted yet. It is all still territorial. We have territories throughout, the North Plains. We have Alaska as a territory. We have a lot of territories. And I think what we're going to get into in the next version of this,
episode 4,
I'm like, yes, are we dropping part 4 right now?
I think we might be starting part 4.
We're setting it up, I think.
Episode 4, the carving of the territories,
is how do we, we have North, South, East, and West Dakota, just because we got to justify.
But no Wyoming.
Wyoming does not exist.
Wyoming does not exist.
We've got a new king. We haven't discussed who yet, but we're gonna have a new one, and all of these things are gonna play a part of all of this. Does anybody else have and we're gonna talk about railroad expansion. We're gonna talk about the Isthmus. Does anybody else have anything though that they want to think about and settle the situation to get to where we're talking about?
I just have one question for you, Chris. Where does the Bass Pro Shop end up in this timeline?
I actually think you might see. I actually think the Bass Pro Shop pyramid might be where the Transcontinental Railroad crosses the Mississippi. Yes,
I agree.
In Memphis, yep,
100%. We always have to find a way to shoehorn the Bass Pro Shop in every one of these parts.
This is going to be a thing, isn't it? I can tell this is turning into a thing. Okay,
this is turning into the next big A Fork in Time meme.
Yeah. Chris has Hi to the Good People. I have this stupid pyramid that shows up every episode.
It's not my fault.
The only thing I want to bring up is somewhere in here we're going to have to deal with Utah and the Salt Lake City.
That's exactly. I was kind of thinking about that too.
So they're going to come up in the next one, based on timeline, just where we are.
I think
Joseph Smith still shows up in Missouri and starts making the moves.
Yeah.
And the other part is, I think that I'm hiding something in the back of my mind, But I think the next episode, and I touched on it earlier, I think religion becomes an interesting issue.
Yeah.
Because we
100%.
100%.
now we've got a significant amount of voodoo practitioners.
We
in
have
the
we
United
have
States. We
a
have a lot
Well,
more Catholics.
We got a bunch of Catholics,
a lot more
Protestants.
Catholics.
We have tripled
We're
our
about to have
Catholic
Mormons.
population.
we got
We're gonna have
Mormons, we got-
Orthodox.
I was gonna say we have
A
an
little bit.
Orthodox. We have a little bit of Orthodox because we have a Russian Orthodox
Oh, yeah.
monarch on the throne.
Mhm.
So now religion is going to be a bigger piece of the equation. But my gut feeling is telling me if we have a lot more Catholics and a lot more religious diversity, that is probably going to lead to, I would say, bigger acceptance or earlier acceptance of differences, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
And so, like in our timeline, for example, we have issues with Irish immigration and basically us saying, hey, the Irish people, so get this. Irish people for a time in America were actually not considered legitimate white people.
Mm-hmm.
Just think
Nope.
about that for a second. And the reason is because they were Catholic. And so in our timeline, we have a lot of, the Know Nothing Party, anti-Catholic, anti-Catholicism sentiment, So I think episode 4, what we're going to be talking about next time is episode 4, A New Pope.
It's still better writing than George Lucas, so I can't be that mad at it. But
I just had to drop that one. I've been waiting 2 episodes for it.
Here's the question. I like that idea. By the way, that might be an episode title.
Somewhere down the line.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
No, for that episode.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
In the earlier episode, King Henry, where we bring in the Prussian, who's Jar Jar?
That depends. Which school of Jar Jar are we going with? Movie canon Jar Jar, where he's just a bumbling idiot, or expanded conspiracy theory universe where Jar Jar is secretly the Sith Lord?
Jar Jar is
set all
actually
of
the
this
Sith
up.
Lord.
Okay,
Yeah.
no,
In which
that's
case,
what we're going to do.
That's
Jar Jar,
Alexander Hamilton.
Jar Jar is the Sith Lord of Wyoming.
I want
Alexander Hamilton. Then Alexander Hamilton is Jar Jar.
Yes,
of Wyoming.
Of Wyoming.
I mean, we have some paradoxical issues we have to sort out with that, but sure, why not?
All right, guys. I think with us officially jumping the shark with this discussion, and it was
No,
my
we've
fault.
jumped the Jar Jar.
We've jumped the Jar Jar. But I think now's about as good a time to either plant our flag or stick a fork in it, depending on your perspective and your point of view. Any other last minute thoughts, guys, before we wrap things up?
I think that's about all we can get out of this one, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, we squeezed all the blood out of this turnip. And
Yep.
so from all of us here on the panel, thank you so much for listening. And you know what we like to always say at the end of these episodes, if you see a fork in time, what should we do?
Take it.
See y'all later, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.